Okay, in this lesson, we're going to start getting into writing some ZIO code. So as I note here, the ZIO type is an incredibly souped up IO data type. And by that, I mean that it has the ability to run all different kinds of effects that you'll ever need to run. And before we get into writing the ZIO code, there's one thing I want to note. So going back to Scala 2, this is what a Scala 2 application would look like. And specifically, what you would do is you create an object, you'd give it a name like hello, and then it would extend this thing called an app, and then everything inside these curly braces here would be the beginning of your main method. And I want to mention that because that's different than Scala 3's main method approach that I've shown previously in this video series and in my other videos. And the reason I mention that is because ZIO takes a similar approach. And when you create ZIO applications, you would import what they call ZIO app default. So ZIO app default is going to replace that app. But what you do is you create an object, you give it a name, and then you extend that. And then down here, you define either a run function or a run variable. And then the code inside of that becomes essentially your main method, what we'd refer to as a main method over here. And I mentioned that information here and here. And you also have to import the ZIO types that are necessary. And you'll see that as we go through these examples. Okay, now what I want to do is move some things around a little bit so we can see what we're working with. So here I have pretty much the simplest hello world example you can write with ZIO. And let me start running this. So I want to run that is ZIO 101.scala, and let's run that with the watch option. So it'll keep compiling and running it. And right away, I see that this is outdated. So we need to bump that up to 21 and update that. Okay, now we're all up to date. So what's going on here is that these two first lines are Scala CLI commands. So the first one says I want to use the latest version of Scala 3 right here. And then the second one, in this case, says I want to use this version of the ZIO library. And as you saw right here, once you include it like this could almost be called include, but it's called using this library. But when you give it the string right here, then it goes off on the internet, it finds what it needs, downloads it onto your computer, and now we're running this version of ZIO right here. And I added this note about how you run this with Scala CLI. So when you run it with Scala CLI, as I showed over here, in this case with the watch option, then it reads these first two lines and it says, okay, we'll use Scala 3 and we'll use ZIO. And then what happens here is it comes back and I import only the things that I need from that ZIO library. And then we start creating a ZIO application. So again, we do that with an object. I give it a name, ZIO 101, and we extend ZIO app default. And as I mentioned, what we do over here is we override this run method. So there's some code inside ZIO app default. You could think of this as being a trait. So you could think of that as being like this. So that would be something like that. And then that would have a run method defined in it. And it would have a certain type over here. And I won't get into that, but it would have a type signature over here. So you could think of this as being an abstract method defined inside of ZIO app default. And then what we're doing here is we're overriding this method. And now specifically in this example, we're saying I want to override it. And this is going to be the body that I want to run right here. So this is a one-liner. Console, as you see, comes in from the ZIO world. So this is the console from there. And then we use the print line function right here, and it prints out hello world, which is the string that you see right down here. So if you've never seen ZIO before, congratulations. This is a hello world application in ZIO. Now, if we look over here, what I do in version 102 is I think the next logical step is to demonstrate how to add a ZIO variable to your application. And so what I do over there is I deconstruct this a little bit. So I say, well, what I want to create over here is a value. So note that this is going to be a value. I name it hello, and then its type. And even actually, before we get into that type, let's just do this part first. You say that is equal to that is what I'm doing. And then inside this area here is I'm just going to say run is just going to be that variable here. And note that also in the book that I changed this to a value. So this one is a value here. And remember that these are variables in the algebraic sense. So this one's a variable and this one's a variable. And then this first one that I'm calling hello is now equal to what was the body before. And the interesting part about that guy, let's see, I don't know what this is going to look like in here, but let's just hover over there. Oh, good. So that actually looks pretty good right there. So this is the expression type I was going to type in, but now you don't have to watch me type. So I can just put that there. And now we can declare that type right there. And I'll widen that. And if it's easier to read, I can move that over there like that. So note that we had code like this. This would be something like that. Here I'm creating a variable named s, and it has a type string, and you don't normally have to declare that, but if you wanted to declare it, you could do it like that. So that's exactly what I'm doing over here is I'm saying this is the variable name, and then this is the type of that variable. And to understand that, let's come back over here to the book. So as I've mentioned before, the mental model for thinking of the ZIO data type is that it's a description of a workflow. And you can think of it as a function. And given an R, that function can produce either an A or an E, as we see in this data type right here. So this is the mental model for thinking about the ZIO data type right here. And in this example, the R stands for the environment that's going to be passed in. E is like the either error handling data type, so that would be like an exception or a throwable typically. And then A is like the either success data type that you really want to see, which is, again, the happy path or the happy result. So now when we look at this signature over here, which I have in the book over here, you can read this like follows. So R is the Scala type any, and that's the ZIO way of saying that the environment that's being passed in here doesn't matter. So basically this code right here does not need any sort of special environment to run. If this needed a clock or a database or something else, some other type of resource, you would pass that in here. But since it doesn't, the ZIO way of saying that it doesn't need anything is to put an any right there. And then the E type is an IO exception, and that's because in theory this could throw an IO exception. So that's why we have that right here. And again, this part right here is just like an either. So the IO exception is in the left part. And then this success value over here is unit because it's printing out to standard out and it doesn't return anything useful. The success value here is a unit. So again, you can think of this part as being the either right there. That's a convenient way to look at that. So again, the environment variable being passed in is the any, and then you have the either variables right over here. And one other thing I note over here is that in the real world, you don't always have to show each variable's data type. So in the real world, you might just see that code written like this and that. But I'm doing that here to be explicit because we're just getting started with ZIO. And as we get started, you'll just want to see types like this just to start becoming comfortable with it. And again, over here, I start talking about the val run part. And I already mentioned that over here that I changed this from a def to a val. And then if you want more details on how that's implemented, I talked about it a little bit before. And then here, if you want to stop the video now and read through this, I talk about the potential way that this is implemented. And so now if I come over here and I make sure that's saved, then I will come over here and I get an error because I missed one of those imports. So here, if you look back over here, I needed to import the ZIO type and I did not do that here. So I would call that ZIO right there and save that. And also we're going to need this IO exception. So let me come back here and import that as well. So I need to import java.io.io exception and I'll save that. And now we have this version of the application running. And note here, I just saw this. I actually left this string in here. And this brings up something that I was going to be talking about later, but I'll talk about it now. You don't want to wrap everything over here in ZIOs. I see that when people first get started working with ZIO, they will wrap everything inside of a ZIO, by which I mean they would come over here and say, well, I want to do a ZIO.attempt or ZIO.success, and they would wrap everything over here on the right side with a ZIO. And you don't want to do that. The only thing you really want to wrap inside of ZIOs are your effects. So interacting with the outside world is an effect because it's a side effect. It's dealing with the outside world. So something like this you do want to implement with a ZIO, and that's exactly what they've done for us inside this console object. But if we were going to write our own printer over here, I would just say, how about just val p equals, and then we might say ZIO dot attempt, and then I would say print line hi. Because this code right here is interacting with the outside world, you will want to wrap it inside of a ZIO, because again, this thing is an effect. And now if I replace that with that and press save, now you see hi printed out here. And that's because that is coming from this code right here. So if I delete all this, that might be a little bit more clear that that's what's going on right there. But I'm getting off on a little tangent here, so let me go back to this. The only thing I'm trying to say in this little tangent or aside is whenever you have a normal value, just type it like you normally would in Scala, just like this one right here. And then the only time you want to use ZIO values is when you have an effect like this. So if this was an option or a try or an either or a future, or you're accessing internet resources using something else or a database or writing somewhere, those are the kind of things you want to wrap inside of a ZIO because you're trying to control these effects. You're trying to turn these effects into blueprints. But normal values that don't have any side effects like this one right there, just leave them the way they are. They're not effects, they're not side effects. Just write them just like I've shown here. And the reason I'm stressing this is that this is the biggest mistake I see, again, is that people try to wrap this code right here inside of some sort of ZIO, and that is a mistake. Don't do that. And actually, what I just showed in that aside is what I'm going to show next. So let's go ahead and dig into this some more. So here, let's imagine that we don't know anything about this console type over here. So we've never heard of it. And we're like, oh my gosh, I need to implement something like this. So we don't know, or we forget that that's implemented. And now what I want to do is try to read some input from somebody. And the way you would do this is, again, you create a value, and just staying consistent with what I have in the book, I would say val username equals something. And in non-FP code, you would just write something like standard in.readline, and then you would prompt the user for what's your name? Something like that right there. And I believe that's going to need to be imported. So I probably want to import scala.io.standard in like that. And let's save that and get some error message going here. So as soon as you look at code like this that has a side effect, you know that you want to wrap that in a ZIO. An important thing, though, about readline right here is that it could fail. So when you have things that can fail, you want to wrap that inside of a ZIO attempt. And an attempt says, I'm going to attempt to do this, but if it fails, I'm going to throw an exception. And so when we do that right there, we don't even have to look at this type, and we could say, well, now we can start typing these ZIO types up here by hand and say, well, I know that this doesn't need any sort of environment passed into it, so the environment is going to be an any. And now you can think that the rest of this area over here, if I expand this over here, remember that this area that I have highlighted is just like an either. So the first thing we're going to type in is the exception, or the left part of the either. And as I just mentioned, this can throw an IO exception, which can be considered a throwable in the Java JVM world. So that could also be an exception, or it could be an IO exception, but typically we do these things as a throwable. So that's the error value. And here, because we are prompting a user for something and then we're reading their input with readline, the success value of this one is going to be a string. And that's all you have to do to fill in the ZIO data type, is to go through that thought process of what is the environment that needs to be passed in, and then think about this area over here as being an either, and then filling in the left and right values for that either. And if I just come back over here to the book for a few moments, I discussed this code right here. So we're prompting user, and then we're going to read whatever they type. And in the second line here, I say to imagine that this code can throw an exception. Off the top of my head, I don't remember if readline can throw an exception. I was thinking the only way it would throw an exception is that there's something really wrong with your computer and it's about to fail. But either way, if you imagine that it can throw an exception, or if it really does throw an exception, that's when you put the throwable right here. And I talked about these two parameters over here as being equivalent to an either. And then down here, I note that attempt is a ZIO factory method. And you use it when literally you attempt to do something that may fail. And because we're imagining that readline can fail, we're going to use attempt here. I note that right here. If this is always going to be guaranteed to succeed, then you would change attempt to succeed like that. But with the assumption that it can fail, we'll go back to attempt like that. And now the only thing I need to do to run this application is to create that run value. So we say value run equals, and all it has to do is equal username. And when this runs, it should prompt me for what's my name, and then we'll get that name back inside here. And actually, we get that name in here, but I don't do anything with it yet. So let me save that and come down here. Sometimes there's a problem with that watch option when you're running interactive code, so I want to get rid of that now and just run it like this. So I cleared the screen just to get rid of some of that history stuff I don't want to see, and now we'll go ahead and run this and type in my name, and there we go. And I should say, as far as we know right now, this code is working, and we don't know that it's working yet because we're not dealing with this string right here inside of the code. So that's what we're going to do over here in the next step.